I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to Christoph, Andreas, and Max for the invitation and for having us talk here. Um, my talk is called Thinking Through Assetization and Value in 3D Printing. And my starting point is the idea that contemporary capitalism is increasingly techno-scientific. It's characterized in particular by what I define as this assetization process thing. Increasing numbers of things are being turned into these assets, basically. And I'll talk about that as I go through the presentation. 3D printing then represents an interesting case because to unpack these processes, because we have to start thinking about what is it about 3D printing that that is an asset, that is involved in these assetization processes. Is it the designs, the printers, the things being copied, and so on and so forth. And so I'll talk about some of these issues with assetization, the capture and extraction of value as it relates to 3D printing. I have a very brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about 3D printing. I have to admit I have limited knowledge here, so there are far better placed people, and the two previous talks are very interesting in that case. And I think actually what I say here echoes what they've also been saying, so I'm quite happy about that. Then I'll talk about assetization and how innovators are increasingly capturing value nowadays, and then I'll talk a bit about the futures, what we might want to think about when it comes to 3D printing. I'll start with 3D printing. So as I said, my background is rather limited here, so I've primarily drawn upon sort of STS perspectives, science technology studies perspectives on 3D printing, and some other social science perspectives. So people like Ratto and Ree, Johan Soderberg, Angela Daly, who I believe spoke yesterday, plus of course our hosts, as it were, Christoph, Andreas, Max. So I think from my brief reading, I've kind of identified four things that I think are relevant when thinking about 3D printing when it comes to this, the relevance of assetization. The first being this notion of there being a particular kind of ethical set of principles behind 3D printing, often associated with things like DIY culture, hacker culture, maker spaces, all these sorts of things. This kind of sort of counterculture kind of sort of ethic and principles, perhaps not non-capitalist, but kind of sort of alternative kind of capitalist notions. And so this often this is about kind of engaged citizens, engaged consumers, consumers and citizens engaged in particular kinds of direct forms of both sort of citizenship and consumption and that sort of thing, prosumption, co-creation, and so on. A second kind of aspect of it is as the two previous presenters were talking about, was this the kind of shift towards more precision forms of production, but using shared forms of resources. So peer-to-peer learning, DIY culture again, but creating your own kind of approach, hobbyism, hobbyist kind of notions, and this modification of mass production around these kinds of ideas of precision production, repair, maintenance, and kind of more sort of consumption oriented kind of approaches. And that means there's a critical role for design here. So production is bound up with design, and here in 3D printing, it's sharing resources, localized kind of approaches, and in many ways this all leads up to this kind of production creation of a commons. The idea that what you want to do here in 3D printing is promote the commons, web-based forms of sharing networks, web studio workshops, free software, co-creation, all these sorts of things that end up muddying the kind of more stringent IP regimes that exist. And this is where assetization comes in. The commons is great, obviously, but it's also a site of value capture and extraction, as Johan Soderberg outlines in his work on 3D printing. And so this is where assetization comes in, and this comes from a new book that I've got, and I'm just going to plug it. And I'm plugging it because it's free and it's open access, so you can go and download it and you don't have to pay for it. So you can just go to the MIT Press website. It's there, open access. And so what assetization helps us do is understand how value is captured and extracted. And so it's about trying to understand the processes that lead up to the transformation of things into these assets, basically. And an asset is defined, and there on the left-hand side of the screen is the definition from the International Accounting Standards. An asset is defined as a resource controlled by an entity as a result of past events, and from which future economic benefits are expected to flow to the entity. And there's a lot to break down here, but you can essentially break it down into, it's about control. An asset is about, understanding the control that entities have over resources as the result of their past actions that lead to future benefits for those entities. And as I said, that we can see assetization, across the board. Almost anything can be assetized. I'm not sure. There are probably things that can't be, but you can assetize, personalities. You can think of Instagram or social media influencers as sort of assetizing their personalities and their lives. Knowledge, obviously, through intellectual property rights. Personal information through kinds of user data, personal data, these sorts of things. Nature and environments through ecosystem services, and so on. So almost anything can be assetized. And assetization involves a series of kind of aspects or characteristics, which I've outlined here again on the slide. So things like an asset is a legal construct. So assetization involves these kind of legal rights and so on. It entails different forms of ownership and control that lead to the extraction of economic rents. So it's a form of rentiership. Assets have very funny kind of supply and demand dynamics. Often involves forms of future discounting of value. So working out the value of something in the future to discount it to work out its value in the present. And this involves forms of the control of value and valuation being dynamic. So what's the relevance to 3D printing here? Well, I think for me, 3D printing represents an intriguing area to unpack these assetization kind of processes. So as I said in the very beginning, are designs assets? Are printers assets? What about copies and derivatives? How might these all be turned into assets? And so just thinking through some of these kinds of issues, I highlighted I think about 4 or 5 different things that are worth considering when it comes to 3D printing with this notion of assetization. So firstly, there's the kind of fact that when thinking about as assetization, it's important to understand the increasing tendency for value to be derived from the selling of services, a function of something, rather than necessarily from to derive from the selling of services, so the function through the ownership of an asset, so the kind of substance. So it's about kind of controlling the resources, the production of resources. So we can think of 3D printer being the kind of productive resource here that then leads to the ability to sell the service. So there's all sorts of elements here around the centrality of flow-through rights. The use of derivatives and copies and the limits that get placed on these as a consequence of the ownership of particular kinds of intellectual property. But it's not just intellectual property, it's also kind of contractual arrangements. So these are key to the kind of business models that are emerging. So licensing, users licensing services, and there's classic examples like just normal printers being an example of the kind of licensing arrangements that are deeply problematic when we start trying to use these printers. And then there are other forms of kind of aspects to these licensing arrangements, like the collection of data and that sort of thing. So there's these reflect a kind of major debates in the ownership, control, and property rights of resources, and the shifting kind of property regimes that now exist. So moving away perhaps from the kind of direct property rights towards more kind of, as I say, these contractual rights. So the things like digital rights management, terms and conditions agreements, all these sorts of things, license agreements and such like, that are increasingly creating kind of enclave economies. And that's one of the reasons that people switch to open source. But there are problems with that, which I'll come back to in a minute. Then thirdly, you also have emergence of new kinds of business models, product to service, shifting away from selling things to selling a service. You can think of, Uber selling the service of mobility rather than selling cars, and so on. And you can see the kind of mechanisms, fourthly, the mechanisms that you use to create these kinds of assets when it comes to something like 3D printing. So as I've already mentioned, digital rights management would be one example of a mechanism for creating an asset here. So this is about how you control the kind of flow through rights and the product, the derivatives of the resource, the productive resource that you control. Now, there's all sorts of interesting issues here around monitoring of compliance, which goes back, I think, to what Peter was talking about in the first presentation. So how do you monitor, compliance with these digital rights management is important, because if you're a producer, you're producing, things with your 3D printer, you can't necessarily, sell it without having a clear provenance to the production process, and to be able to show that you haven't trodden on anyone's IP rights, basically. So there you have to kind of standardize through the process. And so you end up finally with, fifthly, the kind of issue here with 3D relevance to 3D printing, you end up with asset right holders trumping other, stakeholders in the process, locking in users and owners to particular kinds of practices, creating these enclaves, and with highly anti-competitive kind of practices. And all this has implications for the future. So not only with the actual future, but also how we imagine the future. And so people like, obviously, Christoph and Andreas have written about these imaginings of the future of 3D printing, and their point being that the future is obviously highly contingent, but the imaginings of the future inform what the future we can achieve. And so visions, narratives, and so on play an incredibly important role in innovation governance. And assetization entails particular kinds of imaginings of the future, and particular kinds of futures that you want to that end up being able to be brought into existence. So the future is incredibly important here, and this involves various kinds of issues that I've highlighted here. I've highlighted 4 or 5 different kinds of issues, and I'll see if I can get through them all in the remaining time. But the first one being, what is ownership when it comes to thinking about the future of 3D printing? And so it goes back to this notion of the difference between function and substance. It's what is being owned. Is it the service? Is it is it the design? Is it the hardware? And it seems to be more like it's both service and design. So it's both being combined together as the kind of asset representing this ownership claim on the future. So there's a lot of different kind of socio-technical institutions and devices and so on doing work here to ensure that that you can extract, or you can lay this ownership claim on the future. And I've already mentioned some of them, like contractual arrangements, terms and conditions, end user license agreements, privacy agreements, all these sorts of things. And part of the problem here is the desire on the part of the asset holder to lay some form of perpetual claim on the resources needed in the production, in 3D printing and so on, perpetual claim into the future in order to extract as much value as possible. A second kind of issue is around this notion of techno-economic lock-in. So obviously with 3D printing, you don't necessarily have a standard, it's a single standard. So you have a series of technical standards potentially proliferating, and so do you end up, on one hand, you end up getting locked into one standard, and then who controls that standard, or do you end up lacking a technical standard and therefore lacking kind of the capacity for interoperability between different printers and different designs and such like. And this has broader implications. So if you're locked into one technical standard, then one company will control the market. They control the standards, they control the markets, and this is problematic. But if you end up with the lack of a standard, then you end up with a series of enclaves which can't sort of talk to each other. So the third kind of issue, and I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly mention talk a little bit about these. Not briefly talk, I'm just mentioning some points. So there's the issue with inclusive innovation. To what extent is 3D printing inclusive? You have open source, open shared resources, all these sorts of things, and so on. But it's dependent upon skills. People lack certain kinds of skills. The second one, sustainability. It's already been mentioned in Ulrich's talk. So you have notions of localized, self-sufficient production, right to repair, maintenance, the importance of maintenance and these sorts of things. But at the same time, digital technologies increasingly use an increasing amount of energy. Something as simple as computer gaming in California uses the same annual energy use as that of the whole country of Ghana, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, and so on. So you have this increasing problematic energy consequence of these sorts of things. But finally, the other kinds of issues around the financialization of production and the kind of digital, emergence of the digital economy, and the problems of working out this balancing out this issue around niche production, precision production versus mass production, and what's going on there. So I've run over a little bit, but thank you very much for your time.